The phone stopped ringing. Nobody called, not one person. 30 years of showing up, 30 years of shared coffee and shared stress, shared history. And when it ended, silence. I want to talk about that today. Not with bitterness, not with self-pity, just with honesty. Because what that silence revealed is something I think most people feel, but very few say out aloud. When you spend 30 years with the same group of people, you build something, or you think you do. A second family. That's actually what I call them in my mind. People who knew your habits, your humor, your particular way of approaching a problem. People who had seen you under pressure, and they stayed anyways. I assumed that bond existed independently of the workplace, that it would survive the removal of the context that created it. I was wrong. And the speed with which I discovered that was startling. Now, what the silence actually revealed. Within days of leaving, the calls stopped, the messages stopped, the casual check-ins that had been part of my daily rhythm for 3 decades, gone. And I want to be precise here because this matters. I'm not saying these people were false. I'm not saying the relationships weren't real in their moment. What I'm saying is something more uncomfortable than that. Most workplace relationships are transactional by nature, not because people are bad, because institutions are transactional by design. You are brought together by function. You are kept together by proximity. You are held together by shared purpose. Now, remove the function, remove the proximity, remove the shared purpose. What remains is what was always actually there. And in most cases, that's not very much. The philosophical truth underneath this. The Stoics were remarkably clear about this. They distinguished between 3 kinds of friendships. Friendships of utility, built on what each person provides the other. Friendships of pleasure, built on enjoyment of each other's company. And friendships of virtue, built on genuine admiration and care for the other person and who they actually are. Aristotle argued that only the 3rd kind endures. The first 2 dissolve when the utility ends or the pleasure fades. 30 years in the same institution, and I can count on one hand the relationships that were ever genuine and were ever of the 3rd kind. That's not a tragedy, that's just an honest accounting. And there's something almost liberating in seeing it clearly. Here's what surprised me the most. I'm not sad in the way I expected to be. There's solace in it, strange as that sounds, because the silence simplified something. For 30 years, I carried a version of those relationships in my mind, invested in them, worried about them, managed them, brought my energy to them day after day. And the silence told me that investment was mostly one directional. Now, I know, and knowing even when what you know is a little deflating is always better than not knowing. The silence was information, uncomfortable information, but honest. And I spent 30 years learning to prefer honest information over comfortable fiction. This leads me to a wider question, and I think this experience points to something most of us quietly sense but rarely examine. We are lonely in ways we don't admit, even when surrounded by people, because many of the connections we count on are connections of function, not of genuine human recognition. The philosopher Hegel wrote about what he called recognition, the deep human need to be seen by another consciousness not as a role of function, but as a full human being. Most institutional relationships never offer that. They offer proximity, shared purpose, mutual utility, which feels like connection until the institution ends. And then you discover what was actually there. The honest part. Now, I want to say something that keeps me from sliding into cynicism here, because cynicism would be the easiest response to this experience. And I don't think it's the right one. Some of these relationships were genuinely warm in their moment. The shared laughter was real. The support during difficult cases was real. The sense of belonging to something together, that was real. It just wasn't what I thought it was. And there's the difference between these people are false and I misunderstood the nature of what we had. The first response makes them the problem. The second response makes me more honest. I prefer the second. This is the first time I've retired. So what do I know? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the calls come later. Maybe the relationship deepens once the institutional context is removed and something more genuine can emerge. Maybe. But what I do know is that the silence taught me something the noise never could. It showed me which connections were built on who I am and which ones were built on what I did. That's not a comfortable distinction, but it's a true one. And I'd rather have a true one than a comfortable fiction every single time. If you've experienced something similar, the sudden quiet after a career ends, the realization the second family had terms and conditions you weren't fully aware of, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for feeling both the sadness and the strange freedom of it simultaneously. Both things can be true. I'll see you next week.